You were never meant to hear this. Not in a church pew, not in a classroom, not in the smiling pages of America's history books. What happened inside that modest house on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts, was not simply a crime. It was a rupture. A wound in the American soul that never truly healed. On the morning of August 4, 1892, the respectable mask of a wealthy family slipped, and what emerged was raw, primal, and savage. The slaughter of Andrew and Abby Borden, butchered with an axe in broad daylight. 19 blows to the father, 11 to the stepmother. Bone shattered, flesh splintered, eyes staring into nothing. It should have been the work of a mad intruder, a shadow slipping through the curtains of an old Yankee home. That's what the neighbors wanted to believe, because the alternative was unbearable. The alternative was that the killer was not some nameless stranger, but the daughter of the house. Lizzie Borden, 32, unmarried, clever, restless, trapped inside the suffocating expectations of a patriarch who controlled her inheritance like a leash. And yet, this story is not simply about blood on floorboards or courtroom drama. It's about something older, darker. The corruption of family bonds, the psychology of control, and the hidden war between appearances and truth. Fall River in 1892 was a city at war with itself, immigrant labor against Yankee wealth, old traditions buckling under the machinery of progress. The Borden family, perched on their little throne of money and respectability, was rotting from within. Andrew Borden, miserly and hard, built his fortune in coffins. Think about that. A man who made his first wealth by preparing the dead, later raising daughters inside a home that smelled of suppression and resentment. Abby, his second wife, was never mother to Lizzie or Emma, only Mrs. Borden. A symbol of intrusion, an unwelcome presence at the head of their household table. And Lizzie herself, brilliant, frustrated, hemmed in by social codes that strangled any woman who dared to want more. She lived in a time when spinsterhood was not freedom but humiliation, and her father's iron grip ensured she would never truly escape. The morning of August 4th was not random. It was the culmination of decades of suffocation, control, and quiet fury. And once the first scream echoed through that house, America could no longer pretend that its respectable daughters were immune to the darkness festering inside. The house itself is the first suspect. Old New England homes were built like vaults, narrow halls, heavy doors, staircases that creaked like guilty consciences. At 92 2nd Street, privacy was an illusion. Every conversation bled through plaster. Every glance lingered longer than it should. Every silence pressed like a weight on the chest. The air inside was thick with the bitterness of things unsaid. Bridget Sullivan, the Irish maid, lived in the corners like a ghost, her hands raw from scrubbing floors that could never truly shine. She heard what the family pretended not to say, the sharp words between father and daughters, the loaded quiet when Abby entered a room, the resentments that coiled tighter each summer, when the heat turned every room into a pressure chamber. By July of 1892, Bridget had begun to dread the dawn. She said later that the house felt sick, and she wasn't wrong. Andrew Borden, by then 70, had become less a father than a warden. He locked wealth away behind iron doors, hoarded property, strangled every sign of affection beneath the grindstone of control. He gave his daughters nothing but rules and reminders of their dependency. To the world, he was respectable. To his family, he was an executioner of dreams. Abby, broad-shouldered, plain, and unloved, lived in constant suspicion, knowing that neither Emma nor Lizzie would ever grant her the title of mother. The daughters didn't simply dislike her. They treated her presence as an infection. And Lizzie herself, she burned quietly. She had tasted independence in travel, glimpsed other worlds, other women who lived differently. She returned to Fall River with restless eyes and found herself imprisoned in her father's frugal domain. She attended church, organized events, spoke about women's rights, but inside the walls of that house, she was still the obedient daughter, denied her own life. Neighbors began whispering about quarrels. The Bordens kept their shutters drawn tight, but rage bleeds through wood and glass. Witnesses remembered shouting Lizzie's voice raised against her father's and threats about money, wills, property. Andrew had recently altered his estate, planning to leave much to Abby and her relatives. Lizzie knew it. She saw her birthright slipping into hands she despised. So when you imagine that house on the morning of August 4th, don't picture peace disturbed by sudden violence. Picture a trap finally snapping shut. Picture decades of resentment hardening into intent. Picture a daughter who had been stripped of power all her life and who decided that only through blood could she seize it back. The morning began with ordinary tasks, but beneath every gesture was the pulse of something final. Bridget rose early, her head pounding from the relentless August heat, and tended to the kitchen fire. Sweat and smoke clung to her skin. She was ordered to clean the windows, a punishment in disguise, though she'd begged to rest, sick from the suffocating air. Andrew's command had been cold, absolute. Even his maid was not spared his economy of mercy. At the breakfast table, the silence was worse than shouting. Andrew sat at the head, newspaper raised like a shield. Abby hovered, performing her duties, pretending at normalcy. But Lizzie's entrance cut through the room like a blade. Neighbors would later describe her as strange, that weak, detached, intense, moving with the awareness of someone rehearsing. That morning, she ate almost nothing. Her eyes scanned, calculating, absorbing. Conversation drifted to property, as it so often did. Andrew spoke with the finality of law, while Abby nodded in dutiful alliance. Lizzie remained silent, but silence can be more violent than words. In her stillness was contempt, fury, and a verdict only she had reached. It was the silence of a daughter preparing her rebellion. By 9 o'clock, the house had emptied of men. John Morse, Abby's brother-in-law, had departed for errands. Andrew stepped out on his rounds, collecting rents, tightening his hold on Fall River's poor with the same cold fingers he used to control his daughters. The only ones left inside were Lizzie, Abby, and Bridget. 3 women bound together by resentment, duty, and the unspoken knowledge that something was about to break. When Bridget stepped outside to tackle the windows, she felt it, the thickness of the air, the strange weight pressing down on the house. She would later recall hearing a sound, a stifled cry, cut short. She tried to push it from her mind. Servants learned to ignore. But even she couldn't deny the unnatural hush that followed, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Inside, something had already begun. Upstairs, in the guest bedroom, Abby Borden was lured into stillness, whether by trust, surprise, or command. No one ever knew. What followed was not frenzy, but precision. 11 savage blows to the head, each one purposeful, each one erasing the stepmother the daughters had never accepted. Blood soaked into carpet fibers, spattering the wallpaper like a confession written in crimson. And in that moment, the inevitable became unstoppable. One body was down. The balance had tipped. There would have to be another. Andrew Borden returned home just before 11 o'clock. The August sun had baked the streets into glare, and even the air seemed sharp with dust. He climbed the steps to his front door with the tired precision of a man certain of his routine, certain that the walls of his house were shields against the chaos outside. He did not know that his wife's body already lay cooling upstairs, the iron tang of blood seeping into the air like a secret no one dared speak. The front door jammed, as it often did, and Andrew cursed under his breath while Bridget struggled with the lock from the other side. Later, she would testify that she heard Lizzie laugh at his frustration, a small, sharp laugh, too brittle, too deliberate. It was the sound of someone who already knew how this scene would end. Inside, Andrew settled into his ritual. He set his hat down. He stretched out on the parlor sofa, his long frame folding into the cushions with the exhaustion of age. He loosened his boots. The newspaper rustled in his hands, a screen against a world he controlled with money and intimidation. To him, it was just another late morning. To Lizzie, it was the opening she had been waiting for. Bridget, still faint from heat and chores, was dismissed to her attic room to rest. Her absence was not chance. It was arrangement. The house emptied once again, stripped down to 2, father and daughter. Imagine it. The silence pressing like a weight. The ticking of a clock somewhere in the hall. Lizzie standing in the doorway, watching the man who had ruled her life with iron will and locked coffers. To him, she was still a child. To herself, she was a prisoner, but in that moment, she also became executioner. 19 times the axe rose and fell. 19 times bones split and blood sprayed across walls and upholstery. His face was obliterated, his features gone, his authority ended in ruin. Neighbors would later describe the body as unrecognizable. Even his iron grip on his family could not withstand the sheer, relentless determination of a daughter's rebellion. When it was over, the house fell into a silence so deep it almost rang. Upstairs, Abby's body waited. Downstairs, Andrew's corpse bled into the sofa. 2 pillars of authority toppled in less than an hour. And in the center of it all stood Lizzie, untouched, unstained, composed. The most notorious daughter in American history. The first scream did not come from Lizzie. Came from Bridget. She had only just collapsed onto her narrow attic bed, grateful for a stolen moment of rest, when Lizzie's voice cut through the still air. "Maggie, come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody's come in and killed him." Bridget stumbled down the stairs, her stomach twisting. In the sitting room, the sight was so grotesque that her breath left her body. Andrew Borden was no longer a man, he was a ruin. His face had been reduced to pulp, his eye hanging grotesquely from its socket. His head cleaved so many times that even seasoned policemen would later recoil. The respectable patriarch of Fall River had been unmade in his own home. Lizzie stood nearby, perfectly composed. No blood on her hands, no wildness in her voice, only a strange mixture of urgency and detachment, repeating that someone must have broken in, someone must have done this. Bridget froze, not knowing whether to flee, to believe, or to doubt. She ran instead for help, summoning neighbors who poured into the yard like moths to flame. Within minutes, word spread down 2nd Street. Respectable ladies in long skirts whispered behind gloved hands, while men shook their heads in disbelief. That kind of violence didn't happen in their neighborhood, behind their neat white fences. It was chaos breaking through the veneer of order. The police arrived quickly, but their investigation began with hesitation. Fall River's officers were not accustomed to such brutality, least of all within the walls of one of their city's most established families. They moved cautiously, as though the furniture itself might accuse them of trespassing. When they discovered Abby's body upstairs, hacked into silence hours earlier, the house transformed from crime scene to spectacle. 2 bodies, butchered. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of escape. And only one figure who had been present in every moment. Lizzie. Yet she showed no hysteria. No trembling. She spoke with clarity, insisting on intruders, speaking of shadows that had slipped in unseen. But the neighbors whispered among themselves. How could a killer come and go in daylight, unseen by anyone in the bustling street? How could Lizzie be so calm, so controlled, with her father's remains still warm in the room beside her? That day, the facade of the Borden family collapsed. Respectability was stripped away, revealing only horror, and beneath it, the possibility that America's most notorious murderess stood smiling in her stained house, untouched by suspicion she could not forever avoid. The murders were only the beginning. What followed was a spectacle unlike anything Fall River or America had ever seen. Within hours, the Borden home was swarming with officials, neighbors, and reporters, all eager to peer into the secrets of one of the city's most prominent families. But in the chaos of discovery, something far more insidious began: the shaping of narrative. Lizzie, who hours earlier may have stood with blood still drying on her father's clothes, did not behave like a woman undone. She presented herself as composed, almost strategic. She gave interviews freely, repeating her claim that an intruder had committed the crime. Her words were careful, her tone steady, but the details shifted with each telling. A man had slipped in. No, perhaps he was hiding in the barn. Or maybe he vanished before anyone noticed. The story wavered, but Lizzie never did. The press devoured it. Newspapers across the country printed lurid headlines about the axe murder in Massachusetts. The genteel veneer of Fall River society was shattered, and in its place came speculation, suspicion, and fascination. The idea of a woman, a daughter, committing such brutality was almost unthinkable, yet impossible to ignore. For the public, Lizzie became both monster and martyr, a symbol of all the unspoken tensions within families, within society itself. The police, meanwhile, faltered. They found no bloodied clothing, no weapon beyond a hatchet in the basement that looked too clean. But they did find contradictions in Lizzie's words. They found her calmness unnatural, her composure chilling, and they found witnesses who remembered her anger at her father, her complaints about property, her icy distance from Abby. The pieces formed a picture, but it was one the community resisted. Because Lizzie was not just any suspect. She was the daughter of wealth, a woman of standing, a familiar face at church. To accuse her outright was to accuse the very structures that defined Fall River. The trial that loomed would not simply determine her guilt or innocence, it would test the boundaries of class, gender, and power. Could a respectable woman be a savage killer? Could the justice system admit that blood can flow even from the most proper homes? The machinery of reputation began to move. Ministers spoke of Lizzie's Christian devotion. Neighbors whispered doubts but refused certainty. The courtroom was prepared, not just to weigh evidence, but to protect the illusion that society itself could not produce such monstrosity. And yet, the cracks had already begun to show. The trial of Lizzie Borden began in June of 1893, less than a year after the murders, but it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a ritual. Crowds swarmed the courthouse in New Bedford, not just from Massachusetts but from every corner of the nation. Reporters filled the benches, sketch artists captured every shift of expression, and men whispered about the lady with the axe, as though she were both villain and star. Lizzie arrived each day impeccably dressed. Black gowns, lace gloves, her hair neatly pinned, the very image of feminine propriety. To the jury, 12 men of the era's expectations, she presented not as a murderer but as a daughter fragile and wronged. Her composure was unbreakable. She fainted at the right moments, lowered her eyes with just enough humility, and let her defense attorneys sculpt her into an emblem of innocence. The prosecution, however, wielded brutal detail. They displayed skulls of Andrew and Abby in the courtroom, fractured and crushed, inviting the jury to look directly into the violence. They described the axe blows, the silence of the house, the absence of forced entry. They reminded everyone that Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid poison only days before the murders. The implication was unmistakable. This was not accident, not intrusion, but design. Yet when Lizzie was called to speak, her contradictions resurfaced. One moment she claimed she had been in the barn during the killings, looking for lead to fix a sink. Another time she insisted she had been downstairs, heard nothing, saw nothing. Her accounts shifted like sand. But the jurors, men raised to see women as fragile creatures, could not reconcile the image before them, a quiet, respectable church-going spinster with the savagery of 19 axe blows. Outside the courtroom, the press transformed her into myth. Some painted her as a she-devil, whispering of madness and rebellion against patriarchal control. Others portrayed her as a tragic victim of suspicion, her life ruined by the misfortune of proximity. Each headline fed the frenzy. Each sketch etched her deeper into the American imagination. But beneath the performance, the cracks widened. The evidence was thin. The axe head lacked a handle. The clothing tests were inconclusive, and Bridget's testimony painted Lizzie more as strange than murderous. And so the trial became less about facts and more about perception, the ancient war between appearance and truth. In that war, Lizzie wielded something more powerful than an axe. She wielded the very blindness of society itself. When the verdict finally came on June 20, 1893, the courtroom did not breathe. 12 men had spent an hour deliberating over whether Lizzie Borden, the quiet, church-going daughter, had butchered her father and stepmother with an axe. The silence was electric, heavy with the weight of blood and the theater of reputation. Not guilty. The words landed like a stone thrown into deep water, ripples spreading instantly across the room, the town, the nation. Lizzie sagged in relief, her composure finally breaking as she clung to her sister Emma. Spectators gasped, some wept, Others muttered in disbelief. And outside, crowds erupted, half in celebration, half in outrage. The press carried the headline in bold letters across the country. "The lady is free." But understand this, the verdict was not an exoneration of fact. It was an exoneration of image. The jury could not reconcile the savage brutality of the murders with the soft outlines of Lizzie's femininity. To them, it was impossible, unthinkable, that a proper Yankee woman could lift an axe again and again, carving her father's skull into fragments. The brutality contradicted their belief system, and so their belief system won. They acquitted her not because of evidence, but because of blindness. That blindness reveals something deeper about power. Lizzie was shielded not by innocence, but by the structures of her society. Class, gender, respectability, these were her armor. Had she been an immigrant, a servant, or a man, the gallows would have awaited. But Lizzie was untouchable because to condemn her would have meant condemning the illusion that respectable families were safe, that women were incapable of such monstrosity, that the old order still stood unshaken. In truth, the trial did not free Lizzie. It unshackled the myth. From that moment, her name became a ghost that stalked the American psyche. Lizzie Borden was no longer just a daughter, she was an archetype, a symbol of rebellion hidden beneath domestic lace. She revealed that beneath the polished veneer of family life lurked suppressed rage, resentment, and the capacity for violence no gender or class could escape. The acquittal was not justice. It was denial. But denial has its own cost. For though Lizzie walked free, she would never again walk unknown. Her name became a curse, her story a riddle, her life a living reminder that truth can be buried, but it cannot be silenced. Freedom did not mean escape. When Lizzie walked out of that courtroom, she was no longer a daughter, no longer a mere citizen of Fall River. She was a living specter. The jury had spared her the rope, but society had given her a harsher sentence. Eternal suspicion. She returned to 2nd Street at first, but the house was poisoned. Neighbors crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Children whispered cruel rhymes about 40 whacks, their voices carrying like curses in the wind. Former friends refused her invitations. Even the church where she had once been a trusted member now looked upon her with unease. Lizzie had been acquitted by law, but condemned by whispers, so she left the scene of blood behind. With her inheritance secured, the very money she had feared would be denied her. Lizzie and her sister Emma moved to a grand home on the hill, the wealthy district of Fall River. The house was called Maplecroft, a mansion with wide porches and polished halls, the very image of success. But even there, the shadow followed. Servants came and went quickly, unable to tolerate the strange air of the place. Neighbors refused invitations, and though Lizzie entertained, throwing parties with music and laughter, each guest knew they were stepping into the parlor of a woman forever branded with suspicion. Emma eventually left, estranged from her sister. Their bond, once sealed by shared resentment of their stepmother, fractured under the weight of Lizzie's notoriety. Alone, Lizzie grew more eccentric, more isolated, living surrounded by silence and whispers that refused to die. She was wealthy now, yes. Independent, yes. But every freedom she had won was stained. Because Lizzie Borden had become something more than a woman. She had become a legend, a living ghost in the flesh, a figure invoked at parlors and pubs, in newspapers and courtrooms. Parents warned their children with her name. Teachers whispered her tale as a moral lesson. And writers, from pulp journalists to poets, etched her into the fabric of American folklore. She became not Lizzie the person, but Lizzie the archetype. The daughter who turns on the father, the axe hidden behind the lace, the nightmare that respectable society could not suppress. And isn't that the truth of forbidden history? That sometimes the price of rebellion is not death, but transformation to be made eternal, unforgettable, and feared forever. To understand Lizzie Borden is not to ask only whether she wielded the axe, it is to ask why her story, above all others, refused to fade. Why has her name, more than any other in American crime, become a nursery rhyme, a chant passed from child to child, as though the nation itself needed to keep the wound alive? The answer lies in what Lizzie represents. She is not merely accused, she is the embodiment of suppressed rage. A daughter raised in the strict codes of Victorian New England, where obedience was demanded, inheritance controlled, and the family home was less a sanctuary than a cage. For years she lived under the dominance of a father whose thrift shaded into tyranny, who denied his daughters freedom, even comfort, while wealth quietly amassed. The house on 2nd Street was not just small in stature, it was small in spirit. And Lizzie's life was shaped by walls that pressed closer with each passing year. In that pressure, something grew. A hunger, a fury. The very rage society denied women the language to speak. She could not challenge her father in words, could not escape without scandal, could not wield power through legitimate means. And so the myth insists, when all doors are locked, the hand finds an axe. That is why the case reverberated. Because behind the particulars, the prussic acid, the broken skulls, the fainting in court, stood a darker recognition. That the angel of the house might harbor a demon. That beneath the lace and silence of domestic femininity was not purity, but wrought resentment so deep it could shatter bone. This is why the jury's denial mattered. To convict Lizzie would have been to admit that every daughter in every respectable home might harbor similar shadows. That patriarchy itself was not order but tinder. That the family, so carefully presented as the fortress of morality, was itself the site of unspoken violence. Lizzie became America's forbidden mirror, a reminder that the rage of the suppressed does not vanish. It waits, it festers, it sharpens, and when it breaks free, it does not whisper. It howls, it hacks, it leaves blood on the floorboards where everyone swore there was only prayer. In Lizzie Borden's story, the nation glimpsed its own truth, that love and loyalty, when poisoned by control, can curdle into hatred so vast it carves through generations. And that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. The trial ended. The years passed. But Lizzie Borden did not fade. Instead, she multiplied. Her story leapt from newspapers into rhyme, from testimony into folklore, from whispered scandal into the eternal chant of children's games. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. No longer bound to the facts of the case, the actual count of blows, the disputed guilt, Lizzie's story became purified into symbol. The rhyme, passed from playground to playground, stripped her of context and left only essence. A daughter, an axe, and an eruption of violence where obedience was expected. This was the final transformation, from accused woman into archetype. Lizzie became less a person than a code, a shorthand for transgression. Writers seized upon her name. Vaudeville acts parroted her. Painters, playwrights, and eventually filmmakers invoked her as America's dark muse. Each retelling was less about the Borden household and more about the fear and fascination of rebellion inside the home. Because the rhyme wasn't really for children, was it? It was for the adults who taught it to them. A way to keep alive the shudder of recognition. That even the most sacred bonds between father and daughter, mother and child could be severed by violence born from silence. Lizzie's myth thrived because it was useful. A warning, a thrill, a secret acknowledgement that beneath the veneer of domestic order lay something volatile, something uncontainable. And as decades turned to a century, Lizzie Borden lived on, not as a ghost trapped in Fall River, but as a cultural mirror. Her name invoked in jokes, in horror tales, in songs, in nursery rhymes, always reminding America of the forbidden truth it tried to bury in 1892. That violence is not foreign to the home, but native to it. Lizzie's acquittal had made her untouchable. Folklore made her immortal. More than a century has passed since the blood dried on 2nd Street. Yet Lizzie Borden is more alive now than ever. Her face stares from countless book covers. Her story is reenacted in television dramas, operas, and films, and her rhyme is etched into the American subconscious like scripture. She is not remembered as an old woman who died quietly in Fall River in 1927. She is remembered as the girl with the axe, frozen forever in that moment of suspicion. Why? Because Lizzie's myth satisfies a hunger. In an age obsessed with true crime, she is the original icon, the prototype of the forbidden woman, the one who may or may not have committed the unthinkable. Every new podcast, every documentary, Every dramatization returns to her because her story refuses closure. She was acquitted, yes, but not absolved. The gap between what we know and what we feel creates a wound that can never heal, and so we keep picking at it, century after century. Her endurance also speaks to a deeper current, the fascination with female rage. In a culture that long demanded silence and obedience from women, Lizzie became the vessel for everything suppressed. Every adaptation, whether it paints her as guilty or innocent, villain or victim, is really about the fear and allure of what happens when that silence breaks. When the rage that has been hidden beneath aprons and prayers erupts, it terrifies, but it also liberates. This is why Lizzie still haunts us. She is not merely a figure of the past, but a mirror in which each generation sees its own anxieties. To Victorians, she was the collapse of the home. To mid-century America, she was a campfire ghost story. To us, she is the patron saint of true crime obsession, the first name in a lineage of women accused, misunderstood, and mythologized. Her legend bleeds into every new telling of transgression, from headlines about killer mothers to stories of daughters who defy fathers. Each time, the question is not just about guilt or innocence, but about what her story represents. The possibility that the hearth itself can become a slaughterhouse, that beneath lace and civility lies something the culture still cannot face. Lizzie is not finished. She has become a permanent specter in American storytelling, proof that some wounds never close, they only spread. You have heard the facts, the legends, the whispers that echo across a century. But Lizzie Borden is not just a name in a dusty case file. She is a threshold, a door that once opened cannot be shut. And if you have stayed with me this far, then you already know her story is not just about her. It's about you. Think of what Lizzie represents. The dutiful daughter, the silenced voice, the person trapped inside a system designed to keep her obedient. Then think of what happened in that house on 2nd Street. Whether or not she lifted the axe, the murders themselves revealed something monstrous beneath the floorboards of the American family. A truth you were never supposed to see, that power and obedience are a bargain written in blood. And when that bargain breaks, it is not the polite world that survives, it is the raw one. This is why her legend endures. It is not the gore, not the trial, not the nursery rhyme. It is the secret that no authority, no court, no priest dared to name aloud. That beneath every home, beneath every institution, lies a furnace of resentment, rage, and hunger waiting to be fed. Lizzie is the face of that furnace. And once you glimpse it, you cannot unsee it. Understand this. The forbidden is never just outside. It is inside you too. That is why her story grips you, because somewhere in your marrow you recognize it. The mask of civility you wear, the quiet bitterness you bury, the questions you do not dare to ask out loud. Lizzie did not just live them, she became them. That is why she still stalks us. Because she is the reflection of what we could become if the mask ever slipped. And so, this is not just history. This is initiation. The descent is not into Lizzie's house, it is into your own psyche. Into the forbidden places you have walled off, pretending they do not exist. Every man who dares to stare into her eyes is changed, because he realizes the murder was never confined to one home in Fall River. It was and is everywhere. By the end, the house on 2nd Street was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum of whispers, a monument to suspicion. The walls that once held prayers and hymns had absorbed screams, and even when the bodies were buried, the silence inside those rooms was heavier than any coffin. Lizzie remained, but she was never free. She lived in that house for a time after the trial, surrounded by the stares of neighbors, trapped not by bars of iron but by something far more unyielding, the gaze of a community that never forgave her. Emma, her sister, eventually abandoned her. Friends withdrew. Doors closed. And Lizzie herself, even in wealth and inheritance, became a ghost while still alive. The newspapers followed her until they grew tired. The rhyme kept children entertained. But in Fall River she was an exile in plain sight, a woman who walked through her own town like a shadow, carrying a truth that would never be spoken but never forgotten. In her later years, the silence only deepened. Parties at her mansion Maplecroft tried to mask it with laughter, but behind the curtains, whispers persisted. She grew ill, alone, her name still a curse. When she finally died in 1927, the town barely noticed. No grand funeral, no closure. Just a burial in the family plot beside the very parents she was accused of butchering. The cycle closed itself like a jaw snapping shut. Yet here is the paradox. In death, her voice grew louder. The rhyme spread across playgrounds. Her story was reanimated again and again, each telling more macabre, more compelling than the last. The silence of her grave became the soil from which her legend grew uncontrollably. She could not be erased. She became permanent. And so the haunting continues. Every retelling is a resurrection. Every whispered recitation of 40 whacks is another strike of the axe, echoing down the generations. The silence she carried in life was transmuted into noise endless, inescapable noise that binds her forever to America's imagination. The collapse of her family was not the end. It was the beginning of a haunting that has no expiration. Because Lizzie did not just destroy a house. She fractured the illusion of order itself. And once broken, that illusion cannot be mended. This is where it ends. And this is where it begins. Lizzie Borden is not just a woman of 1892, not just a daughter with an axe, not just a defendant who walked free. She is the permanent shadow on the American soul. Her story survives because it was never about her alone. It was about the hidden hunger inside every structure that pretends to be sacred: family, home, community, justice. And when you stare at her long enough, you see that shadow staring back at you. The murders on 2nd Street exposed a truth you were never supposed to face. That order itself is fragile, that blood can soak through respectability, and that the very institutions designed to protect you are built on silence, denial, and control. That is why the trial was a theater, why the acquittal was inevitable, why the rhyme became immortal. Because her story revealed too much, and instead of solving it, society transformed it into folklore. That way the horror could be contained. Or so they thought. But you know better now. You feel it. That furnace we spoke of earlier, the one beneath civility, it doesn't belong to Lizzie alone. It belongs to every man who has swallowed his rage, every family that has hidden its rot, every institution that has buried its crimes. Lizzie was only the mask being torn off, and the face underneath is ours. So here is your dissent. Do not dismiss her as a ghost story. Do not tuck her away in the attic of history. Recognize what her legend demands of you. That you question the illusions you live under. That you recognize the bargain you were born into. That you understand power always comes with a price, and sometimes that price is blood. Her axe still swings not in Fall River, but in the quiet corners of your own life, in the compromises you pretend not to see, in the silences you accept. And when you hear the rhyme, when you see her eyes in an old photograph, when her name surfaces again in yet another retelling, know this. She is not gone. She is the forbidden truth, and once you have heard it, you can never return to innocence. Now you carry her with you, forever. Now it's your turn to step into the shadow. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer, you're part of this descent. I want you to comment, the axe still swings twice below. Not once, twice. Because once you write it, you mark yourself. Twice, and you claim it. That is how the algorithm knows you are awake, and how you prove to yourself that you're not just another tourist in the dark. You're initiated. Subscribe now, because the descent does not end here. Each week, I pull back another layer, another truth that was never meant for you. And if you've already felt the chill tonight, imagine what's waiting when you step deeper.